Thank you, Senator Coons. And I'd like to go back briefly to Mr. Mayor. In your written testimony, you said that the science behind climate change and its effect on minority communities, quote, should not be up for debate. I'm curious, is the Sierra Club, is this a frequent practice to declare areas of science not up for debate, not up for consideration of what the evidence and data show?
If you are relying on the evidence and data, you know, the science, the preponderance of the evidence are there.
Well, I'm bringing data, and I don't ask you to believe any opinions that I may have. You'll hear very few opinions from me. What you'll see is a lot of data, and I hope that the data is clear enough so you can make up your own minds.
First, it is misleading and just plain incorrect to claim that disasters associated with hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, or drought have increased on climate timescales either in the United States or globally. It is further incorrect to associate the increase in costs of disasters with the emission of greenhouse gases. Second point, globally, weather-related losses have not increased since 1990 as a proportion of GDP. They've actually decreased by about 25%. And insured catastrophe losses have not increased as a proportion of GDP since 1960. Hurricanes, point 3, hurricanes have not increased in the U.S. in frequency, intensity, or normalized damage since at least 1900. The same holds for tropical cyclones globally since at least 1970 when we have good data. Fourth, floods have not increased in the U.S. in frequency or intensity since at least 1950. And remarkably, flood losses as a percentage of U.S. GDP have dropped by 75% since 1940. Fifth, tornadoes have not increased in frequency, intensity, or normalized damage since at least 1950, and there's some evidence to suggest they've actually declined. Sixth, drought has, and here I quote the IPCC, for the most part become shorter, less frequent, and cover a smaller portion of the U.S. over the last century. Globally, and I quote from a recent paper in Nature, there has been little change in drought over the past 60 years.
This is what's called a drought index. And the down trending curves here, which are colored yellow, are times of drought when the rainfall is below normal, and green is wet. And so if you just look at from about roughly 1980 something up to about 2000, you'll see that actually there are more wet times than there are dry times. This is not an ongoing drought. And if you look also at the duration of the drought, you'll find they generally last 2 to 3 years, something like that. And then they move on. So the drought last summer was bad. There's no doubt about it. It cost a lot of farmers a lot of money, but it wasn't in any way unusual.
Seventh, now these trends being the case, it is nonetheless a fact that the absolute cost of disasters will increase significantly in coming years, no matter what you think about climate change or a human role in it, simply due to greater wealth and populations exposed in locations that are prone to extremes.
To begin with, I need to say who I am, primarily because there has been a lot of politics injected into science these days. And so I am simply a geologist with 50 years of expertise and research in global climate change all over the world. I'm a lifelong environmentalist. I am a scientist. I'm not political. I don't have any particular bias towards either party, so I have no political agenda. I'm not associated with or funded by any business group. I'm not a shill for big oil, big coal, big anybody. All of my research has been funded by governmental agencies. And I'm currently working actively with an international group of geologists, atmospheric physicists, meteorologists, astrophysicists, oceanographers, and seal experts, and other sciences in various parts of the world. That's where I'm coming from. If we go back 500 years, this graph shows essentially temperature on the left-hand side and the year AD on the bottom. Each one of these red peaks is a warm period. Each one of the blue peaks is a cool period. Climate is not constant. It's changing all the time, and it changes in cycles, warm, cool, warm, cool, warm, cool, with about a 30-year time span between each one. So we could count these warm periods, and we can count 20 periods of global warming and global cooling that have occurred in the past 500 years. none of which could possibly have been caused by CO2 because CO2 had not begun to rise until 1945.
I want to put everything we've been talking about into a little broader climate context. And this is a chart that will be submitted as part of the record tomorrow, and at least a few members of the committee might be able to see it. The point here, which I will restate orally, is that, yes, we are unusually warm right now, just like we were 1,000 years ago during the medieval warm period and 2,000 years ago during the Roman warm period. Now, those previous warm periods couldn't have been our fault. The point is, climate varies naturally. I know the title of today's hearing is something like Climate Change, It's Happening Today, or something like that. Well, yeah, and it's always changed. The question is, so what? How much of that change is due to humans? That is a question which I believe I am the only witness today who has actually actively researched and published on. For instance, we have a new paper that's just been accepted for publication, which looks at not only the warming we've seen in the atmosphere over the last, let's say, 50 years, but also the warming we've seen in the oceans. Dr. Cullen mentioned the importance of not just focusing on the atmosphere, but also looking at the warming in the oceans, and she's very correct. And we've done that, and when we take into account how much the deep oceans have warmed since the 1950s, and take into account the effect of El Niños and La Niñas and increasing carbon dioxide and all of the other forcing mechanisms that the IPCC uses in their climate model runs, we find that the climate system is relatively insensitive, consistent with the big graphic that was shown earlier, where it showed that we're not warming nearly as fast as the IPCC climate models suggest we should have.
If you are relying on the evidence and data, the science, the preponderance of the evidence are there.
Let me say something about global warming. There's nothing new about global warming. It goes on all the time. It has been going on for thousands of years at much higher rates, much more intense for longer periods of time than we've experienced in the last period of global warming since CO2 began to be elevated. If we go back even farther, if we go back 10,000 years, this is temperature on the left-hand side. Sorry, it's not labeled. And these are years before present on the bottom. The red curve you see here these are temperatures that are higher than the present temperatures. And so this is 10,000 years ago at the left-hand side. This is present on the right-hand side. Look how much of the last 10,000 years the temperatures have been higher than they are now. Almost all of the last 10,000 years, except for the period beginning about 1,300 years ago, almost all of that, the temperatures on Earth were actually warmer than they are right now. So what about all the claims then that temperatures are warmer now than they have ever been? These are patently not true. And those claims come from manipulation of data. Here is the real original data. The hottest year of record, number one for the number of, this is the number of temperature records that were broken. Number one is 1936. Everybody has acknowledged that 1936 was the warmest period, warmest year of this century, until NOAA and NASA began to manipulate the old data and made it cooler. And then they elevated the recent temperature, made them warmer, and so they come up with a headline saying, oh, it's warmer now than it was then. This is the original data before they manipulated it. This is a number of temperature records that were broken in any given year. These are years down here. So here we are right here, and now we're breaking somewhere around 2,000 records, temperature records for warmth. And you think, wow, 2,000, that's a lot. But look at what it was doing in 1936 and 1934, 10,000. We are setting record highs at a rate of about only a fourth of those that occurred in the 1930s. The heat wave index for 1936 is right here. And look at the period of 1930, 1940 relative to where we are now. This again confirms what I have just said, that the 1930s were warmer than they are right now. We had more heat records broken. We had higher temperatures. It was a hotter decade.
If you are relying on the evidence and data, you know, the science, the preponderance of the evidence are there.
But that's a different thing than saying we should not debate a question, that the Sierra Club has declared this scientific issue resolved, and there should be no debate.
Based upon the preponderance of the evidence, the science is settled. But the thing is that anything is up for debate, Senator. We can debate anything.
Those are the big questions. So let's have a debate about that. Roy Spencer is a climatologist at the University of Alabama. He's skeptical about man causing global warming. To debate him, we have, well, actually, we have an empty chair. We ask a dozen scientists who are concerned about man causing global warming to debate Roy. Most refused. The Union of Concerned Scientists says that debating you, Roy, would be doing the public a disservice because it would give your extreme ideas credibility. So what do you say to that? It's how you're portrayed as this wacky extremist.
Well, as you've already mentioned, John, I don't deny that there's been warming. In fact, I don't even deny that some of the warming is due to mankind. What I deny is that we have any clue how much of the warming, whether it's 10% or 90%, I don't think we have a clue.
All right, so before we hear from you, I want to hear from both sides on this issue. So we did find a scientist who was alarmed about man causing global warming, who was willing to talk about this as long as it was not a debate. So, Roy, get lost. Go away if you would take a seat over there, and let's welcome NASA scientist Gavin Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt, come on in. You work for the Goddard.
I work for the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is a NASA offshoot in New York City.
All right, so why is Roy Spencer wrong in saying we're not sure about man causing it?
So you made a good point earlier on. You said that climate changes all the time. It has, and it has done for many, many different reasons. It's changed because we've had big volcanoes. It's changed because the sun has changed. It's changed because there have been orbital wobbles in the Earth's path around the sun that has caused like ice ages to come and go. All of those things are totally true. So we've looked at the sun. It's not the sun. We've looked at volcanoes. It's not volcanoes. We've looked at the orbit. It's not the orbit.
This time, it's not those things.
But what we've been doing the last 150 years is we've been increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over 40% in terms of carbon dioxide. We've more than doubled the amount of methane, which is another greenhouse gas. And the signatures of those changes are very, very clear all the way through the system.
Assuming this is true, why is it necessarily a problem? Warmer might be better. More people die from cold than warmth.
We have built a society, an agricultural system, and cities, and everything that we do based on assumptions that basically the climate is not going to change. The fact that we have so much infrastructure right near the shore is because we didn't expect the sea level to rise. The damage that we had from Hurricane Sandy was increased because sea level has increased by 10 to 12 inches in this area.
But here's the rate of rise. It's about 7 inches per century.
President Obama says wildfires are increasing, hurricanes are increasing, drought. Is this true? I thought these things have always happened, and this is alarmism. You agree with that?
So there are some things that we can look at and we can say, okay, they're changing. Heat waves.
Wow, 2,000. That's a lot. But look at what it was doing in 1936 and 1934. 10,000.
We're having more extreme heat waves over a wider area.
Hurricanes, you mentioned Sandy.
Okay, hurricanes, there's more uncertainty in the science of hurricanes.
Are they increasing?
It's a tricky thing, hurricanes.
Hurricanes have not increased in the U.S. in frequency, intensity, or normalized damage since at least 1900. The same holds for tropical cyclones globally since at least 1970, when we have good data.
We have this graph of hurricanes by decade, and they don't show any increase.
Right, so I didn't say they did. But we're seeing more intense rainfall. That's very clear over the whole of the U.S., over Europe, and in other places as well. And now what's going on in the future, that's where we're concerned about. Because
so what can we do? What
we're doing right now is not nothing. What we're doing right now is we're increasing the amount of carbon dioxide every year, year on year.
What can we do about it? We like burning fossil fuels.
No,
It's life.
you know what? You like the product of burning fossil fuels. Like you mentioned before, earlier on, about how dirty the air was when there was unrestricted burning of coal, right? We don't like actually burning coal. What we like is the energy that comes from coal, right? What we like is energy.
Yeah,
and
we like energy, and even if we cut our emissions in half, it wouldn't affect the world.
The red line at the top is the business as usual. The blue line is what happens if we just do Paris as written, and then the green line is Paris plus anticipated refinements of those commitments for the next 70 years. And at the end of that, for all our costs and all the problems created, we've purchased about 0.17 degrees reduction in the global average temperature.
Oh, it would. If we cut our emissions by half,
It would be a tenth of the world's CO2. And
Well,
we're not going to cut it in half.
well, eventually we will, because eventually this is going to be a problem that is so large that we will transition to a more
But
renewable.
China isn't cutting, India isn't cutting.
That's a big problem, and they're not going to take a lead on this because we haven't taken a lead.
But
on
why should we make poor people suffer?
it. I don't say you shouldn't make poor people
If
suffer.
you make fuel cost more, that hurts poor people.
Then you give it back as a rebate, and you make people understand that what we need to do is move off carbon sources of fuel.
I'm not qualified to debate you climatologists. Why won't you debate Roy Spencer? He's not a flake. He helped produce the data that the government uses for the atmospheric temperatures.
I'm not a politician. You know, I'm here because you asked me to come on and talk about the science, and I'm totally happy to do that. And anytime you want to ask me again, just give me a call and I will come here and I will tell you about the science and I will point you in the right direction. But I'm not interested in doing this because it's good TV. I'm interested because what we have discovered as a scientific community needs to be talked about. And you need to talk about it, and Roy needs to talk about it, and all these people need to talk about it. But I don't need to be arguing with people just to make good TV.
Thank you, Gavin Schmidt. I appreciate you coming in. I would love to have you back. And if you would give the chair up again, let's bring Roy Spencer in to reply to what you said. Or stay if you like.
I'm not interested. But thank you very much.
We can debate anything.
Dr. Spencer, can you? So, what do you say to what he says?
Well, Gavin said quite a bit. I agree with some of what he says. I speak out because I believe that forcing unrealistic, expensive energy solutions upon the poor is going to kill people. We know that poverty kills. That's not theoretical. It happens today. I would rather save people today from poverty than theoretically save people in the future.
You've also said that carbon dioxide can make the planet greener.
Well, that's pretty well understood. There's hundreds of papers that have been published by plant physiologists that show that increasing CO2 is good for basically all the plants that they study, even crops like corn. My long-term prediction is that eventually we're going to realize that more CO2 in the atmosphere is actually a good thing. And considering the fact that it is necessary for life on Earth to have CO2 in the atmosphere, it's amazing how little there is in the atmosphere.
The perception among my friends here in New York is that you're this weird outlier, and all the other serious scientists say, man's doing it, we've got to fix it now.
Well, I hate to say it, but that's, you know, a characterization that's come about because of the media. I mean, people like Al Gore portray people like me as fringe, and when in fact
he won't debate anybody
either. Well, no, of course not. I consider my views pretty mainstream, and I know there's a lot of
climatology. You find a lot of people.
I find a lot of people that agree with me, but will not speak out because they're afraid that they might lose their funding. All you hear from on the other side from me are scientists who have decided to take a stand publicly, get involved with the politicians,
and if you say there's this big problem, that's when you get money to fix the problem.
Yeah, Congress doesn't give money out for things that are not problems.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we debate what I agree is a very important piece of legislation, in my opinion, and many others would have very detrimental effects on our economy if it was implemented the way it's been drafted. We've been trying to get a quantifiable grasp on the cost of this bill, how much it would actually cost American families, how many jobs would be created and lost. And number one, on the science side, we've had very divergent views. We've had dozens of experts come over the last few days and testify, giving very different opinions on the science. On the economics of it, we have not had the same kind of divergence. In fact, most economists and experts that have testified on the cost acknowledge, in fact, I'll refer to President Obama's own budget that was just passed 2 weeks ago. If you go to page 119 of the president's budget, he's anticipating generating $646 billion in new tax revenue from this bill. So clearly the president expects this bill to generate $646 billion in new taxes that even his own budget director has said would be passed on to consumers.
Congressman, you began by denying that there is a consensus on the science. There is a consensus on the science.
Well, you must have been listening to our testimony that we've had for the last few days with dozens of experts that have come in who have given completely different views.
Well,
I would encourage you to go back and look at the testimony this committee's heard.
There are people who still believe that the moon landing was staged on a movie lot in Arizona.
And neither of us are one of those, and I know you like giving those cute anecdotes. This is not a cutesy issue. We're talking about something that can export millions of jobs out of our economy, out of our country, and testimony's been given just to those numbers. And so we're talking about a serious consequence that there would be on this country and the carbon leakage that would occur where the carbon would be emitted, but it would be emitted in China and India, and the jobs would go to China and India. And that's been testified before this committee in the last few days as well. So would you testify about the actual cost? Do you want to talk about the cost?
Man-made global warming pollution causes global warming. That's not a cutesy issue. It's not an open issue.
It's not up for scientific debate.
It's your opinion. Obviously, you've stated it many times.
Would you talk to the cost? Opinion of the global scientific community, and more importantly,
and not in unanimity. There are others on the other side.
More importantly, Congressman, that opinion is the opinion of the scientific studies conducted by the largest corporate carbon polluters 14 years ago, who have lied to you and who have lied to the American people for 14 years.
And you talk about carbon, and I'm running out of time. We talk about carbon polluters. You talk about them. It's my understanding that back in 1997, when you were vice president, Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, was involved in discussions with you at the White House about helping develop this type of policy, this trading scheme. And is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? It's been reported.
I don't know, but I met with Ken Lay, as lots of people did, before anybody knew that he was a crook.
Right, and clearly you can see why so many of us are concerned about this type of cap-and-trade energy tax that would be literally turning over this country's energy economy.
I didn't know him well enough to call him Kenny Boy.
Well, but you knew him well enough to help devise this trading scheme, and obviously we know what Enron and these big guys on Wall Street like Goldman Sachs, and I know you've got interest with Goldman Sachs.
No.
These people, well, that's been reported. Is that not accurate?
No, I wish I did.
With executives from you're partnered in companies with executives from Goldman Sachs. Well, with executives from you're partnered in companies with executives from Goldman Sachs. Well, if you're not, either way, Enron clearly had an interest in doing this when they were around. We saw what they did. And when you see the types of people involved in wanting to set up this kind of scheme, you can see why so many of us are concerned about turning our energy economy over to a scheme that was devised by companies like Enron and some of these Wall Street firms that have wrecked our financial economy.
I don't really know if you want me to respond to that. I guess what you're trying to say, you're trying to...
I mean, clearly there will be big winners and big losers.
You're trying to say there's some kind of guilt by association? Is that
not association? I'm saying that there are going to be big winners and big losers in this bill, and that's been discussed by everybody talking. Big winners and big losers. But some of the big winners are some of the very financial experts that help destroy our financial marketplace. And I think that should be noted, that companies like Enron helped come up with this trading scheme that would be invoked in
Enron didn't create this proposal in any way, shape, or form.
Well, Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, was involved in discussions with you at the White House about helping develop this type of policy, this trading scheme. And is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? It's been reported.
I don't know, but I don't know. But Enron didn't create this proposal in any way, shape, or form.
Well, the details are not in this bill.
False accusation.
The details are not in this bill, and I would suggest that they are.
And there should be no debate.
Based upon the preponderance of the evidence, the science is settled. But the thing is that anything is up for debate, Senator. We can debate anything.
Well, you know, I would note that even the phrase preponderance of the evidence, having been a practicing lawyer for many years, means 51%. That means 49, at least 51% is what the preponderance means. You know, I would ask, for example, if you want to end debate, you don't want to address the facts. How do you address the fact that in the last 18 years, the satellite data show no demonstrable warming whatsoever?
Sir, I would rely upon the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I would rely upon the evidence, and again, from our own NOAA officials. The data are there.
I'm showing you the original data. And what you're looking at is the data that has been tampered with by NOAA and by NASA. And I could show you curves of what that data looked like in 1936, what it looked like in 1980, what it looked like in 1990 and 2000. And the temperatures, the high temperatures in the 1930s get cooler every year. They put out a new issue. And the temperatures that are in the 2000 plus get warmer because they have frankly tampered with the data. That's the difference between what you're looking at and what I'm looking at. Mine is the original data.
One quick follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
So National Science Foundation, NASA, and NOAA have manipulated the data.
Yes, that's true.
And I would rely upon the evidence, and again, from our own NOAA officials.
This is manipulated data by NOAA, NASA, or the subunit of NASA that deals with climate. And what they do is they make what they call adjustments to their data, the net effect of which is to make the earlier warm periods, like the 1930s, cooler and raise the temperature of the last decade artificially, not from the original data. Mine is original data.
Is this a conspiracy?
I'm not into conspiracy, so I have no comment on that. I'm simply a data purveyor, so I'm going to present you with data, and you can draw your own conclusions.
The data.
Is it correct that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming?
No.
This is satellite data. This is the best data we have. It is untampered, unadjusted. It is taken from real readings from satellites, and it gives a good overall global average. This peak right here is 1998, and since then it has gone down, came up a little bit, and as in recent years has been on a sharp downward bend. I'll show you what the overall trend is for the decade in a moment. And that is confirmed by ground measurements. These are mostly ground measurements. The top two here are satellite measurements compared to ground measurements, which are these lower three colors right here. And you can see the shape of the curve is essentially the same. So the ground data and the satellite data essentially agree that we have indeed had global cooling for the last decade or two.
Is it correct that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming?
No.
How is it incorrect?
Based upon our experts, it's been refuted long ago, and there's it's not up for scientific debate.
Today we have a special guest, Professor John Christie, who, according to Michael Mann, who we interviewed, is one of the most interesting and reasonable people who stands on the opposite side of the climate debate as Michael Mann. So we thought it would be great to ask Professor Christie about his views, and in particular about satellite data that he has been looking at for many years. So Professor Christie, great to have you. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about that satellite data?
Okay, I've been looking at climate issues for over 50 years, as a matter of fact. And when we talk about what I do is I like to build data sets so that we can answer questions about climate, what it's doing, and maybe why it's doing what it's doing. And so one of those big data sets that we built was from satellites, where satellites can take microwave emissions from oxygen in the atmosphere. So we could tell the temperature of the deep layer of the atmosphere. This is from the surface to 15,000 feet or so, or 35,000 feet. And this deep layer is important because all the atmospheric things happen there. Our satellite data has been around a long time, and we have made several adjustments to it. And in the latest paper that we've published just a couple of years ago, it indicates that the UAH satellite data is the one that agrees the best with independent measurements there are. So notions that the satellite data have been debunked are news to me, because we have been publishing all along and providing adjustments and improvements through time.
So it's truly news to you. You mean nobody told you that they feel like your data was debunked? Because that's what Michael Mann said on his interview.
I think these are kind of urban legends, but if you go to the peer-reviewed literature, and this is where we published in the International Journal of Remote Sensing just 2 years ago, the latest and most comprehensive analysis of all the different data sets, and our satellite data sets, the UH one did extremely well in comparison with independent data that's taken, for example, by balloon releases.
So, I mean, if you had to play devil's advocate, what would you say would be the weakness of the satellite data? Is it that it's not complete enough, that the error bars are too large, that there could be something not accounted for in the models of how you then interpret it? Or if you just wanted to step on the other side and be the devil's advocate, what would you say?
I'd say what we encountered is that sometimes these sensors that are on these spacecraft are not perfectly stable. And so you have to be careful to make sure that you intercompare with other satellites already in orbit to make sure that they don't go astray. And in one case, two satellites went astray basically in the same way. And so we had to backtrack and fix those kinds of things. So it's not knowing precisely the characterization of the instrument once it's in space.
Okay. Now, if those things were off, would it be very strange that they correlate well with the hot air balloon, or weather balloon data?
No, if they were off, you would see the difference between that and balloon measurements. And so that's why we use these, and balloons are completely independent from the satellite measurements. So it's a good check against how we're doing.
Okay. So even as devil advocate, you can't really say that one problem would have caused a problem because you have good correlation with the weather balloon data. So yeah, I'm drawing a blank as to why somebody would say your data has been debunked.
Based upon our experts, it's been refuted long ago.
Now, what would happen if your data was true, but also the data that Michael Mann looks at, the hockey stick, everything like that, is also true? Is there any way to reconcile those?
Oh, well, when you're talking about data from paleoclimate records and so on, and the satellite data of the last 41 years, those are two kind of different data sets. I think what we do in building data sets like this that are truly global is these are great tools and information to check theories with. And so the thing that we do the most is we check the theories that people come up with about the climate, and mainly those theories come out in climate models. And so what the climate models show is that the world is warming much more rapidly than the actual data actually show. And so this is a real important aspect of satellite data, but it's not just our satellite data. We use data from the balloons, like I said. We use data from weather centers around the world that create global data sets. So we have multiple evidences that these models, 100% of them, by the way, are warming the planet more than it actually is.
Okay. Well, I could see that the models, even 100% of the models, are over predicting the warming. I could see that. But that doesn't mean that the Earth is not warming up, and that other things, because I know they used to call it global warming. Now they call it climate change. I know that was a strategic decision because some parts of the world might get colder, even in their own models. So it's not really like everything's warming up. So all that to say that you would agree that even if 100% of the models are over predicting warming, there could still be some huge problems with how much CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. Okay, that you would agree that that's a possibility, right? Wouldn't you agree that?
Well, you say that's a possibility. An asteroid could destroy the Earth tomorrow. That's a possibility too. But what we have done in many, many ways is examine these claims about things getting worse, and they simply are not. Whether you're talking about hurricanes or tornadoes or floods or droughts or heat waves and so on, we've examined those trends, and they just are not significant one way or the other. Although maybe tornadoes are significantly down, but that can change, I think. So we test those very claims you've mentioned. Our satellite data show the Earth is warming at about a rate of 1.5 degrees C per century. That's a warming that has happened in the geologic past, certainly. And it is a warming rate that is much more gradual than the dire predictions that tend to dominate the media and so on.
So Michael Mann said he enjoys talking to you. If you told Michael Mann in a friendly conversation over drinks that all the things that are in the media about how there's more hurricanes and more forest fires have been shown to be wrong, would you say, yeah, I know the media gets this all wrong. Of course, it's not statistically significantly more, but if the world is warming up, and I think it is, of course, he thinks it is, then there would be more power in the hurricanes. So we should expect to see more hurricanes in the future, even if we're not statistically noticing the trend now. Our statistics are not great, so it might take a lot of hurricanes before it's a statistically significant, and yet we know it's going to happen because the oceans are warming. Is that the kind of approach he might take, or would he disagree with you? He says, no, it's statistically significant. There are more hurricanes. What would he say?
I don't think Michael would say that there is a statistically significant change in hurricanes because it's just not true. I mean, the data are pretty clear on that. But this notion that they could get worse, that's a very popular notion. So we look very carefully at those kinds of things and say, well, in the time that we have had an increase in carbon dioxide, which is true, and therefore there is a greater radiative forcing from carbon dioxide, that's true. Carbon dioxide can't not be a greenhouse gas. It's going to absorb at the 15 micron band for sure. We look and do not see the response that people claim should be there. We look at the response in many parts of the climate system and don't see the response that is hypothesized to occur. And that's the guts of science. You make a claim, let's find some independent data to check that claim and determine if that claim is true or false.
All right. So another argument is, okay, fine, we're predicting more warming than there actually is. Okay, but on a balance, maybe it's going to help people, do better about pollution and things and hurting the environment, making organisms go extinct, all kinds of bad things that humans have done to this planet we live on. Isn't it okay that maybe our models are a little bit overblown, or is there a real negative side to believing in those models and putting those in the media?
Well, there is an extremely negative side, and someone who has lived in Africa, I can tell you that without energy, life is brutal and short. So if you want to condemn hundreds of millions of people to poverty and difficult lives, tell them that they can't have energy. And right now, the way it is in the real world is that carbon is the fastest and safest way for these impoverished folks especially to arrive at the energy access they need for their improvement of life. If you really care about people living longer and better like we really care about, then you would want that to happen. And so these energy policies that are based upon these rapid climate models are just not based on the right kind of science. And the rates of warming now that we actually see are not alarming. I mean, people are not dying because of this tiny bit of warming that we see. And so so that's where the policy, really comes in, is when you try to make energy policy based upon climate models that are really exaggerating what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, in a scenario that you just described, I could kind of imagine, okay, we'll make a new Paris Accord that says if you're in a developing country, you can still burn, fossil fuel. If you're in a more modern country, you have to just do solar and wind and nuclear and all these other things because even though one guy's model, John Christie's model says it's not a big deal, we got to be careful. We know that there's more greenhouse gas. We know there's more CO2. You agree that there's more. That might be bad. That might be really bad. And even if his models don't show it, we can't just trust that. We got to be careful here. So would that be a good strategy? Would you support that kind of a strategy?
Well, first of all, I don't have a model. These are real data that we're talking about, that I'm talking about, real data that disproves, that invalidates basically what models are showing. So to separate that.
If you are relying on the evidence and data, the science, the preponderance of the evidence are there.
And another thing is that, we can pass all kinds of regulations at the United Nations level or this level, but the impoverished world is going to do what it's going to do. And we can just see the evidence in the rising amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere right now. We're not going to stop the fact that they want to have longer and better lives just like we do. So is it our role to say you can't do this? And I don't think morally we have that leg to stand on. Now, there are a lot of pollution problems, and you touched on this earlier, that when you talk about water pollution and air pollution, and carbon dioxide is not an air pollutant, by the way. And so you talk about the aerosols that cause various diseases, or the water pollution that kills millions of people around the world today. These are points that we can address and we do know how to fix. And those are things we should focus on, I think.
I agree. We should definitely focus on the things that are killing people. That's really true. You said that people in developing worlds are not going to listen to what the UN says because they're going to want a better life. What I was saying is, well, let's make a Paris Accord or whatnot that tells the developing world you can use fossil fuel. Go for it. We want you to have longer, healthier lives. But the rest of the world, we're going to really try to not do carbon emissions and sequester the carbon and do all that kind of stuff. Would you support that kind of a policy?
Only if it made sense. Solar and wind do not make sense. I just read a report from Washington State how they cannot go to any more wind because these things are causing such terrible problems and load balancings and so on with that state's electricity grid. So solar and wind will not solve it. Nuclear could, in terms of emissions. Nuclear is a big way to provide that type of energy, that energy on demand that a current economy, a modern economy needs. Unfortunately, in this country, the red tape is so deep to try to get a nuclear plant built that it's just really tough. I asked Georgia Power and Southern Company what it's like to build the Vogtle plant out there in Savannah right now, or near Savannah. So we've got a lot of problems with nuclear that aren't physics problems. They are red tape problems.
Based upon our experts, it's been refuted long ago, and it's not up for scientific debate.
I'm curious if I want to understand this. I do find it highly interesting that the president of the Sierra Club, when asked what the satellite data demonstrate about warming, apparently is relying on staff. So it's just a mistake. The nice thing about the satellite data is these are objective numbers.
Correct.
And the numbers over the last 18 years, are you familiar with the phrase, the pause?
The answer is yes, and essentially we rest on our position.
And to what you said, you are familiar with the pause, so to what does the phrase the pause refer? I'm sorry, you said you were familiar with that term, so I asked to what does it refer?
Essentially, it's the slowing in global warming during the 40s, sir.
This peak right here is 1998.
During the 40s. Is it not the term that global warming alarmists have used to explain the inconvenient truth, to use a phrase popularized by former Vice President Al Gore, that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming whatsoever? Global warming alarmists call that the pause because the computer models say there should be dramatic warming, And yet the actual satellites taking the measurement don't show any significant warming.
But, Senator, 97% of the scientists concur and agree that there is global warming.
I've heard 97%, 98%. There's a recent paper by John Cook and co-authors who looked at thousands of research papers which have been published in the scientific literature to see what fraction, support the scientific consensus on global warming. Well, it turns out that the 97% consensus that they found, I am indeed part of. And Senator Sessions mentioned he would agree with it too. And my associate, John Christie, he agrees with it. In fact, all skeptics that I know of that work in this business, all are part of that 97%, because the 97% includes people who think humans have some influence on climate. Well, that's a fairly innocuous statement. And that's something that continually annoys me, is those of us that are called deniers. It's never actually, I think the D word was actually used by the chairman today. It's never actually been pointed out. What is it that we deny? Also, this 97%. Well, what does the 97% consensus mean? What do all of those people agree to? Well, they agree to something fairly innocuous, and it's something that most of us agree to, that humans must have some influence on climate. The question is how much, and how much influence makes all the difference in the world if you're going to be basing policy decisions, carbon taxes, regulations, legislation, whatever, on them. It makes all the difference in the world exactly how much warming we can expect due to human activities.
I see every day quoted 97% of all scientists believe that man-made CO2 causes global warming. That's a fraudulent statement. And the statement that there is a dominant consensus among scientists that CO2 is causing global warming is not based on any known fact. And let me tell you where this number comes from, and let me tell you where that off-quoted statement comes from. There was a graduate student who, this was in Indiana or Illinois, sent out 10,257 questionnaires to climate scientists. He got 3,146 back responses. Of those, he selected either 77 or 79, I'm not quite sure the numbers, correct, it doesn't matter, that he handpicked out of these 3,000 responses. And he asked those people, do you think CO2 is causing climate change? And funny thing, all but 2 said yes, because they were hand-selected. And so the real number is that there were 77 or 75 scientists out of 30,100, not out of 77 or 79. So if you divide this number over that number, you get 2%. So the consensus that you're hearing is 2%, not 98%.
But, Senator, 97% of the scientists concur and agree that there is global warming.
I have some information that you would find interesting. It's called the Petition Project. And this was a petition, and let me read what the statement says. It says, there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. How many scientists who have degrees in one of the sciences signed that? And the answer is 31,487, as opposed to the 77 in this survey that's so oft quoted. So I would say the consensus is that scientists do not believe that CO2 is causing global warming, not the other way around. So if you compare what you're seeing on the screen with what I've just read you, of these 31,000 scientists who signed this statement, all have degrees in one of the sciences, and 9,029 have PhDs in those. And the expertise of these is atmospheric, environmental, earth sciences, computer and mathematical sciences, physics and aerospace sciences, chemistry, biology, agriculture. These are real scientists, and there are 31,000 of them. In order for the statement to be true that either the consensus is that CO2 is causing it, you would need to have 32,000 people signed, and there are about 4,000 people who were involved in the IPCC project. And by admission of the chairman of the IPCC for the UN, 80% of those are non-scientists. If you look at the 27 people who wrote the executive summary for the 2007 report, which is so often quoted, guess how many have experience in meteorology? None.
But Senator, 97% of the scientists concur and agree that there is global warming and anthropogenic impact with regards to global.
The problem with that statistic that gets cited a lot is it's based on one bogus study. And indeed, your response, I would point that your response is quite striking. I asked about the science and the evidence, the actual data. We have satellites. They're measuring temperature. That should be relevant. And your answer was, pay no attention to your lying eyes and the numbers that the satellites show. Instead, listen to the scientists who are receiving massive grants.
I find a lot of people that agree with me but will not speak out because they're afraid that they might lose their funding.
Who tell us, do not debate the science.
Sir, this is one of the national pastimes in America, and while we're debating what 97% of scientists have already settled.
In fact, all skeptics that I know of that work in this business, all are part of that 97%.
The 3% that we, as I say, have invested in with regards to the carbon industry, you know, our planet is cooking and heating up and warming. So this is one of the reasons why.
So hold on a second. It is the Sierra Club's position that right now the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming. Is that the Sierra Club's? I mean, I just want to quote you and understand.
I am saying I concur with 97% of the world's scientists with regards to global warming and the anthropogenic effects of mankind with regards to climate.
I thank the chairman, the ranking members for the opportunity to offer testimony today. Prior to 2009, I felt that supporting the IPCC consensus on climate change was a responsible thing to do. I bought into the argument, don't trust what one scientist says, trust what an international team of 1,000 scientists has said after years of careful deliberation. That all changed for me in November 2009 following the leaked ClimateGate emails that illustrated the sausage making and even bullying that went into building the consensus. I started speaking out, saying that scientists needed to do better at making the data and supporting information publicly available, being more transparent about how they reach conclusions, doing a better job of assessing uncertainties, and actively engaging with scientists having minority perspectives. The response of my colleagues to this is summed up by the title of a 2010 article in the Scientific American, Climate Heretic Judith Curry Turns on Her Colleagues. I came to the growing realization that I had fallen into the trap of groupthink. I had accepted the consensus based on second-order evidence, the assertion that a consensus existed. I began making an independent assessment of topics in climate science that had the most relevance to policy. And what have I concluded from this assessment? Human-caused climate change is a theory in which the basic mechanism is well understood, but whose magnitude is highly uncertain. No one questions that surface temperatures have increased overall since 1880, or that humans are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, or that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have a warming effect on the planet. However, there is considerable uncertainty and disagreement about the most consequential issues, whether the warming has been dominated by human causes versus natural variability, how much the planet will warm in the 21st century, and whether warming is dangerous.
Climate scientist has now come under pressure to resign over a series of leaked emails which global warming skeptics say point to a mass conspiracy. The scandal erupted after a research server was hacked into and private emails and documents were released, suggesting that scientists may have colluded to prevent the release of climate data. For more on this, we are now joined by our London correspondent, Laura Emmett. So, Laura, wow, interesting subject here indeed. I'll get straight to the point. This issue seems to be causing a lot of controversy. How likely is it that people will lose their jobs over this?
Well, Rory, I think in order to assess that, really, it's important to look at who all these people are that are involved. Obviously, there's Professor Jones, who is the scientist at the heart of this recent leaked email scandal. He stands accused, basically, of massaging the figures that relate to temperature globally.
Is this a conspiracy?
Then, of course, there's the University of East Anglia, which is the university that he works for. He's the head of the Climate Research Centre, and that's the top source of temperature data in the world. So it's a very important research institute when it comes to climate change. And the person who has called for his resignation is none other than George Monbiot. And as I'm sure you know, Rory, George Monbiot is a leading environmentalist. Really, his name is synonymous with green issues in the UK.
The International Panel on Climate Change, Environment Canada, National Geographic, and many other scientific bodies and publications assert that the average global temperature has risen by 0.6 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. This assertion is based on a dataset provided by the Climate Research Unit, headed by Phil Jones, a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. When asked by independent researcher Warwick Hughes for the raw data behind the dataset, Dr. Jones replied, "We have 25 or so years invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it?" Since then, Steve McIntyre also attempted to get the raw data from the UK Met Office, but his Freedom of Information request was denied, with the UK Met Office citing a secret non-disclosure agreement they had with Dr. Jones, the documentation for which they could no longer find. In Dangerous Deception, a recent article in the Canada Free Press, Dr. Tim Ball, a former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg, explains why this lack of transparency is so worrying. Recently, the Corbett Report had a chance to talk to Dr. Tim Ball about transparency, intellectual honesty, and the climate change debate.
If you're working in a lab or in a university and you're playing around with ideas and experiments and so on, there's always an academic or scientific responsibility that you have to be able to show your work and explain your work and so on. And in many cases, that's not being fulfilled. I mean, the hockey stick. Where finally it was tested after how they'd done it was disclosed, saying, no, we can't, this is wrong. But when you go public and say, here's the results and this is the truth, then there's a social responsibility that kicks in. And unfortunately, and in some ways, if the politician does it, that's fine, because the credibility of politicians is so low. And the public understand they're doing it for a political motive. But when you get a scientist going public with it for a political motive, bringing the credibility of science to it, but doing it for their own political agenda, then you have really crossed that line between the scientific responsibility and the social responsibility. And in fact, I'm writing an article right now about a scientist. One of his pieces of information was that the world's warmed by 1 degree Fahrenheit or 0.6 degrees Celsius in the last 130 years. Well, he's refusing to disclose how he came up with that number. And I mean, I personally think that that's almost criminal. If you are, what are you hiding? If it's just numbers, what's the problem? And he actually wrote an email to Warwick Hughes, the Australian researcher, said, you know, how did you get this number? And he said, why should I share that with you? It took 25 years of my work, and all you want to do is find fault with it. that's a scary comment coming from a scientist. He's still blocking it, by the way. He's using the UK Met Office to claim that there's confidentiality. Now, the public might say, well, how is this a big deal? I mean, surely there's the raw data, and then you come up, anybody can get the raw data and match his numbers. But what the public need to know is that there are 4 major agencies producing global temperature on an annual basis. They come up with different numbers each year. And the number, I remember one year, it varied by 0.4 degrees Celsius. Well, if you're saying 0.6 in 100 years and each year you're differing by 0.4, using the same data, well, the reason there's a difference is because you don't use the raw data. You adjust, you modify, manipulate the raw data. And of course, at what point are you doing it to get the result that you want? Well, if you're not willing to disclose how you came up with your number, the suspicion has to be, you cooked the books, fella.
Is this a conspiracy?
And I think if that number of 0.6, which is quoted everywhere, National Geographic have it on, the NOAA.
And I would rely upon the evidence, and again, from our own NOAA officials.
American National Oceanographic, they've on their website, Environment Canada used the number. And yet here, the guy that produced it is not willing to explain how he got it. We got a serious problem on our hands. And of course, what's interesting is nobody wants to come out and say, you cooked the books. But what other explanation can you come up with for not disclosing that information? I mean, how could it be possibly secret or confidential? The difficulty is, and Tolstoy identified this 100 years ago, you know, that if you've made a career out of selling an idea and to your friends and to your colleagues and to the world, and then you've got to be the one that comes out and says, gee, you know what I told you, completely wrong. That's tough, very tough. And but if we're going to influence entire energy and economic programs for the world, because cap and trade, Kyoto, all of these things are based on these numbers, there is a massive, massive social responsibility. And unfortunately, there have been enough of these people that have not been willing to accept that and have crossed the line. So it isn't just that the politicians have politicized science, it's those scientists that have politicized science that are the problem.
The central issue in the scientific debate on climate change is the extent to which the recent and future warming is caused by humans versus natural climate variability. Research effort and funding has focused on understanding human causes of climate change. However, we have been misled in our quest to understand climate change by not paying sufficient attention to natural causes of climate variability, in particular from the sun and from the long-term oscillations in ocean circulations. Why do scientists disagree about climate change? The historical data is sparse and inadequate. There's disagreement about the value of different classes of evidence, notably the value of global climate models. There's disagreement about the appropriate logical framework for linking and assessing the evidence. And scientists disagree over assessments of areas of ambiguity and ignorance. How then and why have climate scientists come to a consensus about a very complex scientific problem that the scientists themselves acknowledge has substantial and fundamental uncertainties? Climate scientists have become entangled in an acrimonious political debate that has polarized the scientific community. As a result of my analyses that challenge IPCC conclusions, I have been called a denier by other climate scientists, and most recently by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. My motives have been questioned by Representative Grijalva in a recent letter sent to the president of Georgia Tech. There is enormous pressure for climate scientists to conform to the so-called consensus. This pressure comes not only from politicians, but from federal funding agencies, universities, and professional societies, and scientists themselves who are green activists. Reinforcing this consensus are strong monetary, reputational, and authority interests.
I find a lot of people that agree with me but will not speak out because they're afraid that they might lose their funding.
In this politicized environment, advocating for carbon dioxide emissions reductions is becoming the default, expected position for climate scientists. This advocacy extends to the professional society that publish journals and organize conference. Policy advocacy, when combined with understating the uncertainties, risks destroying science's reputation for honesty and objectivity, without which scientists become regarded as merely another lobbyist group.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to address the committee. There's two issues I want to talk about. First, I'd like to address the role of the White House in policy-relevant research performed by government employees, which this committee is obviously concerned with today. As a NASA employee performing climate change research during the Clinton-Gore administration, I was told what I could and could not say during congressional testimony, since it was well known that I was skeptical of the view that mankind's greenhouse gas emissions are mostly responsible for global warming. I just assumed that this advice was to help protect Vice President Gore's political agenda on the subject. But this did not particularly bother me, since I knew that as an employee of an executive branch agency, NASA, my boss ultimately resided in the White House, and to the extent that my work had policy relevance, it seemed entirely appropriate to me that the privilege of working for NASA included a responsibility to abide by direction from my superiors. But when I finally did tire of the limits on my interactions with Congress and the press, I resigned from NASA in 2001 and assumed my present position as a university employee, where I have more freedom to speak on climate issues. Now, secondly, today, and more importantly, I'd like to present some of the latest scientific research regarding the relative roles of mankind and nature in climate change. As you might know, there remains considerable uncertainty over just how sensitive the climate system is to our greenhouse gas emissions. But now we have peer-reviewed and published evidence, both theoretical and observational, that climate sensitivity estimates previously diagnosed from satellite data have been too high. The two papers describing that work are referenced in my written testimony. And furthermore, in recent weeks, I believe we have attained what has been called the holy grail of climate research, which is a true measurement of climate sensitivity. We have discovered why previous sensitivity estimates have been so high and so uncertain. They have been contaminated by natural cloud variability. And we have even developed two methods of removing that contamination. An analysis of 6 years of our latest and most accurate NASA satellite data reveals evidence of very low climate sensitivity. When translated into an estimate of future global warming, it would be less than 1 degree C by 2100, well below the range of the IPCC's estimates of future warming. If this new evidence of low climate sensitivity is indeed true, it also means, and this is very important, if we have low climate sensitivity, that also means that the radiative forcing being caused by the CO2 we've put into the atmosphere is not nearly enough to explain the warming we've seen in the last 100 years. There must be also some sort of natural warming mechanism involved. And this is where the IPCC process has failed us. The IPCC has been almost totally silent on potential natural explanations.
The idea that humans are heating the planet dangerously is due mostly to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, United Nations body supposedly made up of top climate experts. This IPCC is what the government listens to most.
There's a group of scientists called the International Panel on Climate Change, 4,000 of them. Guys in white coats who run around and don't have a sense of humour. They just measure things. And what they say to us is that it's happening and it's caused by human activity.
But Donna Laframboise, a Canadian journalist, has checked just who writes these IPCC reports and published the results in a new book, The Delinquent Teenager Who Was Mistaken for the World's Top Climate Expert. Donna, thanks for joining me. Is the IPCC really made up of 4,000 top scientists?
Well, that's a fairy tale that politicians really like to believe in, but in fact, that's a very, very problematic number. The last big IPCC report was written by 450 lead authors with an additional 800 secondary authors. That comes to 1,250. That's a pretty big far cry from 4,000. So first of all, the number is problematic. And secondly, is it 4,000 of the world's top scientists? Well, I'm afraid it's not. I found out that some of the people writing this report are actually graduate students in their 20s. They're, some of them 10 years away from even getting their PhDs.
How could that
That's
happen?
not a top scientist. That's, you know what? I'm not sure. I think they just, they didn't get any scrutiny. They really didn't. They said, this is what we're doing, and we're a collection of top scientists, and we all believed them, and no one bothered to double check.
Is it the case then that people are being chosen, some of the examples you give, people who hadn't even done their PhD yet, they're chosen because they agree with the opinion, not because they could prove it?
Well, you know, one suspects that that's what was going on, that in fact people were chosen because they perhaps could be easily led. They were young and could be easily led, perhaps because they had already expressed the kind of opinion the IPCC brass was hoping the report would express. It's not clear, but it certainly looks fishy.
And lastly, we were told that it relies on peer-reviewed science. That doesn't seem to be the case from what you seem to have established.
Well, that's the other thing. That's the other big fairy tale here. The chairman of the IPCC has been going around the planet assuring us that the reports are based only, solely, and exclusively on peer-reviewed science. Well, when I actually decided to check out how many of the sources cited by the IPCC were published in peer-reviewed scientific academic journals, only 2/3 were. And we also discovered that 21 out of the 44 chapters had so few peer-reviewed sources that that chapter would have received an F on a grade school report card.
And this is where the IPCC process has failed us. The IPCC has been almost totally silent on potential natural explanations for global warming. Although they mention a couple of external influences such as volcanic eruptions and small fluctuations in solar output as possible minor players, but they have totally ignored the 800-pound gorilla in the room: natural, internal, chaotic fluctuations in the climate system. In my written testimony, I show with a simple climate model a simple example of how small cloud variations associated with two known modes of natural climate variability, the El Nino-La Nina phenomenon and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, might explain 70% of the global average warming in the last 100 years, as well as its basic character, the warming that was experienced until 1940, slight cooling or constant temperatures till about the 1970s, and then resumed warming up until recently, since the satellite data shows that warming stopped about 7 years ago. But as Dr. Trenberth mentioned, short-term results are no indication of future potential. Now, while these new results that I'm talking about are not yet published, I did present them in a seminar to about 40 climate researchers at the University of Colorado last week, and I received no serious objections to my analysis. It seems that the IPCC leadership has a history of ignoring natural climate variability. I often wonder what evidence for natural sources of warming might have been found if the same amount of money and manpower was put to the task as the IPCC has used over the years. After all, remember, the IPCC is tasked with dealing with the human influence on climate, so they don't have a whole lot of motivation for finding possible natural explanations. There's a story I'd like to relate to you, and I've never told it before. In the early days of the IPCC, I was visiting the head of the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, the director, Dr. Robert Watson, who later became the first chairman of the IPCC. He informed me and a work associate with me that since we now had started to regulate ozone-depleting substances under the 1987 Montreal Protocol,
The next goal, in his mind, was to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning. This was nearly 20 years ago. There was no mention of the scientific basis for that goal. So as you can see from the beginning of the IPCC process, it has been guided by desired policy outcomes, not science. I believe that most of the scientists involved in the IPCC are indeed reputable and honest, but they have been used by politicians, bureaucrats, and a handful of sympathetic and outspoken scientists.
Is this a conspiracy?
You know, our planet is cooking and heating up and warming. So this is one of the reasons why.
So hold on a second. It is the Sierra Club's position that right now the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming. Is that the Sierra Club's? I mean, I just want to quote you and understand.
I am saying I concur with 97% of the world's scientists with regards to global warming and the anthropogenic effects of mankind with regards to climate.
But sir, would you answer the question? Is it the Sierra Club's position, as you just testified, that the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming right now? Is that the Sierra Club's position?
Global temperatures are on the rise, sir.
And I assume the Sierra Club would issue a public retraction if confronted with the facts that the data are precisely as I described, that over the last 18 years, there has been no significant warming, and indeed, that is why global warming alarmists invented the term the pause to explain what they call the pause in global warming, because the data demonstrate what you just said, that the Earth is cooking and warming is not backed up by the data.
We are concurring with 97% of the scientists that absolutely say the opposite, sir.
97% of all scientists believe that man-made CO2 causes global warming. That's a fraudulent statement.
So if the data are contrary to your testimony, would the Sierra Club issue a retraction?
Sir, we concur with the 97% scientific consensus with regards to global warming.
I'd like to repeat, certainly in a moment, but I'd like to repeat the question and get an answer. If the data are contrary to your testimony, would the Sierra Club issue a retraction?
We concur with 97% of the scientists that believe that the anthropogenic impacts of mankind with regards to global warming are true.
So does that mean you're not willing to answer the question?
We can concur with the preponderance of the evidence and the science at 97%. You're asking me if we take the 3% over the 97%?
No, I'm actually not asking about a survey among scientists. I'm asking about the objective data, the numbers.
The scientists rely upon their objective data and their analysis, and 97% have concurred and conclude that global warming is indeed a fact.
You know, Mr. Meyer, I find it striking that for a public policy organization that purports to focus exclusively on environmental issues, that you're not willing to tell this committee that you would issue a retraction if your testimony is objectively false under scientific data. That undermines the credibility of any organization if you will persist in a political position regardless of what the science shows, regardless of the facts, regardless of the evidence, and regardless of the data. That is not consistent, I would suggest, with sound public policy.
Sir, you can pick whatever, choose and cherry pick whatever data you wish, but I concur with the 97% of scientists who concur that global warming is a fact.
You know, I think there's a lot of people over in Copenhagen right now who, as we heard, are trying to find some decisions, some legally binding frameworks that will push us towards some sort of unanimous decision. I felt that where I was with my project and really with the ability to articulate solutions, which is what we need right now, I was better placed staying here in San Francisco to try and actually showcase that it's past the point of talking. It's past the point of talking. It's past the point. We know historically that the global governance, the sort of agenda, the global governance to these issues is very hard to try and, with all the best intentions, it's very hard to actually activate.
Is this a conspiracy?